We live in the age of the selfie. You're familiar with this phenomenon, right? At some point, you have partaken in it or watched someone else done it and gotten frustrated, or somewhere in between that spectrum. And I was doing some research this week about the phenomenon that did not exist when I was younger that exists now of the selfie. I found out some interesting stats I thought I'd share with you today. 95% of teens have taken a selfie. The only real question there is, what did the other 5% get grounded for, right? I mean, that's the only question. 95% of teens have taken selfies. More people died last year from taking selfies than from shark attacks. Maybe we don't pay as much attention as to where we're taking selfies, but every time I get near an ocean, I'm watching for sharks. Maybe that's why it is. 55% of millennials have taken selfies and shared them via social media. 74% of all images shared on Snapchat are selfies. 100 selfies are posted just to Instagram every second. Now, in the time I gave you to ponder that, 200 pictures just got taken. Do you see my point? 100 just to Instagram every second. There are 93 million selfies taken each day, which would represent 2.5 million rolls of film. Now, a roll of film is this thing that used to be in a camera, and you'd take it to the store, and you'd have to wait to see your pictures. It was terribly torturous, but it existed, and I do remember that. 2.5 million rolls of film every day. If we want one advanced technology has provided in a good way, is that's a whole lot of waste that could get produced taking pictures. All that to say, we live in this culture where we're inundated with the idea of focusing on ourselves. Now, a selfie is not always bad. I have taken them. I've taken them with my kids. I've taken them at places. They are not innately wrong, but they do point to an issue beneath the surface that can become troublesome. We can become focused on us. We can begin to see ourselves as the center of a story. We can begin to be entitled and to think that our life is somehow more important than everybody else's. But in a world of 7 to 8 billion people, everybody's way can't be the most important. So in light of a culture that tells us to focus on us, what does Jesus say? Good morning. We're so glad that you're here today. My name is Rambo. I am one of the pastors here at the Orchard in Tupelo. We're honored that you're joining us. If you're here in Tupelo, if you're with our friends at Northside, good morning, Northside. If you're on live stream or Facebook Live, however and wherever you're joining us, we're honored that of all the things you could do this Sunday morning, you'd create space and time to be in worship with us as we begin a brand new series for the next 3 weeks called Selfless, where we want to talk about this idea that in a world that is selfie-centered, how do we begin to wrestle with the call of Jesus to follow after him and live in rhythm with him? So today we're going to begin that conversation in the Gospel of Luke. So New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke chapter 14. If you brought your Bible or a device that you read on, you may want to turn there. But if you're here in Tupelo or at Northside and you didn't bring a Bible with you, you can raise your hand right where you're seated. Some of our greeters are moving around the room. I see a couple of hands up here in Tupelo. We'd love to bring you a Bible. The Bible you'll get, page 797, will get you to Luke chapter 14. You can use this Bible during a service. You can leave it in a chair when you're done. Greeters got a couple more in the back right here from where I'm standing. You'll have your eyes out for that. Luke 14. You can leave it in a chair when you're done, but if you don't own a Bible that you can read and understand, we want this Bible to be our free gift to you. We believe the Bible is the Word of God. By reading it, we get a better idea of who God is. And by having a better idea of who God is, we have a better idea of who we are called to be. If this Bible would help you on your journey, it's our free gift to you. We love to give away Bibles here at the Orchard. Luke 14, Matthew, Mark, Luke, third gospel, Luke 14. And we're going to read 25 through 33. Luke 14, 25 through 33. This is what Luke writes. A large crowd was following Jesus. He, Jesus, turned around and said to them, if you want to be my disciple, you must hate everyone else by comparison. Your father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. But don't begin until you've counted the cost, for who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money, and then everyone would laugh at you. They would say, there's that person who started the building and couldn't afford to finish it. Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down with his counselors to discuss whether his army of 10,000 could defeat the 20,000 soldiers marching against them? And if he can't, he will send a delegation to discuss terms of peace while the enemy is still far away. So, if you cannot become my disciple without giving up everything you own. So let's paint the scene. In Luke's gospel, almost everything that Luke talks about has this idea, this motif, this understanding that Jesus is on a journey. So you have some unique stories in Luke that are about travel and roads, and you have things like the prodigal son who comes back, and on the road his father sees him. So much of the story is about a journey. And where we are in Luke 14, Jesus is making his way from Galilee in the north, headed to Jerusalem. And Jesus is headed there to die on the cross. But notice the comparison that Jesus gives. There's a large crowd following after Jesus. There's a crowd and they are interested. But if you're Jesus, you got to wonder, do they understand what I'm headed to Jerusalem for? I mean, it's easy to be part of a crowd. It's easy to be caught up in the rush. Here, Jesus has to look at it and go, look, if I share with them what's really going on, are they going to stay or go? I mean, the crowd that follows after Jesus thinks Jesus is headed to Jerusalem for a victory parade, but he knows he's on a death march. If Jesus shares everything with them that it's about to unfold, will the crowd stay? Will they follow? Or will they turn away? So it's with that in mind that it says that Jesus turns and he faces the crowd. And Jesus uses a word that we're a little uncomfortable with, aren't we? What word does Jesus use that we don't necessarily like? Hate. He uses the word hate. We read that and we get an emotional reaction. Jesus says, if you want to be my disciples, you got to hate everyone else. Well, we don't like that. I mean, we try to tone that word down. You may want to look at other translations and see if it's really the word hate. Well, when you break it down in the original language, it is the word hate. But it doesn't mean the same thing when we use the word hate. You see, in the original language here, in the Greek, it's the word miseo, M-I-S-E-O. M-I-S-E-O. Miseo. That's the Greek word that's there. And I don't tell you that because you need to know every Greek word. I want to give you a little more context. In Jesus' day and age, what miseo meant was it meant a strong word that means you had an affection for something, but now it's not as important as it used to be. It's a decreasing of importance. One study that I looked at this week said it is to disavow previous allegiance. It doesn't mean that you hate. It doesn't have the emotions when we hear the word hate. But it means, and I think the NLT that I read from today, kind of gets to that when it says, you must hate everything else by comparison. What Jesus is saying is that Jesus doesn't step on the scene to be one of our options. Jesus steps onto the scene and invites us into a relationship with him that every other relationship we have is seen in light of our relationship with Jesus. It doesn't mean that I hate my wife and I hate my kids. It means that the first and most primary relationship in my life is not my family here on earth, but my Heavenly Father and Jesus who saved me. That's my first. Every other relationship, every network, every group I'm a part of, every role that I play, my job, everything else is not my primary identifier. But my primary identifier is that I'm a beloved son of Jesus. That's my primary identification, and everything else is seen through it. That's what Jesus is trying to get at. Every other thing begins to take a secondary role in our life. And this is complicated. This is complicated because we grow up in a world that says we should do everything we can to build up our own reputation, build our resume. How many of us went through, some of you are in high school right now, so I'll just give you an insight into something that's happening. Some of us went through high school and we joined clubs and groups and took on roles because people said it would look really good on our scholarship applications. We build this resume, and so then when you get out, you get experience and you take jobs that even if you don't like, you're building your resume. We're building our reputation, and all of that has its proper place in business. But I think business practices and educational practices we've taken and we've adapted them to our spiritual life as well. Some of us spend more energy trying to appear like we are what we want to be. Some of us, I'm going to say that again. Some of us spend too much energy trying to appear to be the people we really want to be. We build a facade, we fake it till we make it, we build up our resume, and we build up our reputation. But one of the things that I think Jesus challenges us to here is some of us need to lose our hard-earned reputation so we can find our truest identity. Some of us need to lose our hard-earned reputation so we can find our truest identity. Some of us are more content to build up a platform that everything looks good through social media than we are losing our lives for Jesus in the sake of the gospel. Some of us need to lose our hard-earned reputation. All the things we've tried to do to appear just right by the world standards, we need to lose that so we can figure out what it means to be a follower of Jesus. That's why Jesus says, unless you lose your life, you can't keep it. But anybody who gives their lives away will find it. We will find, when we give our lives away, we find who we're actually supposed to be. In the 1900s, there was a great English pastor named John Stott. John Stott came to faith when he was at an early age, but really felt a call into ministry when he was in college. And when he began to have that conversation with his dad, Arthur, it did not go very well. His dad was agnostic. He did not believe that, he was curious, but he did not believe in the God of the Scriptures. And so his dad, who was a doctor, had these huge ambitions for his son's life, and he saves up money and he sends him off to college. And wouldn't you know it, he comes back from college and says, I want to be a pastor. And his dad ripped him up one side and down the other, because he saw it as a waste of Stott's ability, his gifts, his place in the world. And when Stott, years later, is reflecting on that, he says this: when the Christian loses himself, he finds himself. He discovers his true identity. Christ is Lord over all our lives, including career. God's plan may be different from our parents or our own. John Stott never quit loving his father. It wasn't hate because he now detested his dad because he stood opposed to the call that was on Stott's life. He never quit loving his father. But he did not allow his dad's voice to supersede the calling and beckoning of Jesus Christ. You see, it's not complicated to follow after Jesus when Jesus' invitation leads us to live differently than those we don't like. It's a whole nother thing when the call of Jesus invites us to live differently than those we love. That's what Stott had to wrestle with. And Jesus keeps going. He talks about it here. Jesus knows this is not easy. We're going to analyze this in every level. But so Jesus keeps going, though. He says, unless you hate even yourself. Now, some of us, we've made this a practice, hadn't we? We know how to speak negatively to ourselves. We know how to be self-destructive. We know how to be self-loathing. We walk through it with our children who somewhere along the way pick up the pattern that the first moment you correct them means they're terrible and they're awful, and they go down that line, and some of us have never grown out of that phase. Some of us can't stand criticism and pushback because our identity goes straight to, well, I'm a failure, I'm terrible at everything I do. Your spouse comes in and goes, hey, I think we need to work on this. And you go, I'm a terrible husband, I'm a terrible wife. I'm sorry, I'm failing you in every way. You'd have been better off if blah, 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 blah. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is saying we don't need to be the ones who are responsible for forming our own identity. But our identity is formed not by the accumulation of our own good behavior, but on what Jesus has done for us. One of my favorite authors is C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, most famous for the Chronicles of Narnia. I go about once a quarter and I quote something from Lewis. This is one of my all-time favorite quotes. He says, "Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less." Humility is not beating yourself up. It's not turning down every compliment. Humility is not destroying yourself with negative conversation. Humility is not having to think about yourself at all. Humility is beginning to see and look for opportunities to serve others. Humility is not focused on how everything affects you. You see, what Jesus is getting after is that if we're going to follow after him, we're no longer going to be the centers of our own story. To follow after Jesus means that we're willing to lay everything else aside and to let the world and ourselves see us through the lens of Jesus before they identify us any other way. And in a selfie-centered world, this is a revolutionary thought. This is a challenging thought. When everything else we see is everyone else working on their own versions of self-promotion. I was riding in the car a couple of weeks ago with one of the great voices of insight and wisdom in my life, my 4-year-old Isaac. And so we're riding through Tupelo and we're talking about something that had happened, and we're laughing and telling jokes, a lot of bathroom humor because it was just the two boys in the car. And so as we're talking and it kind of simmers down a little bit, I go, "Hey, buddy, who's your hero?" And I kind of thought there were 3 real options here. Batman, Luke Skywalker, either of those characters because they're on the predominant percentage of his underwear. So I thought there was a real good chance that Batman or Luke Skywalker would come up. But kind of thought it was maybe me. Kind of thought he might say Dad. I mean, look, we're talking about Selfless, but I'm not perfect, okay? I'm in process. So Isaac thinks for a minute, and he's got this look about him, and he goes, "Me. I'm my own hero, Dad." And I just laughed. And then I pulled over and wrote it down, and I was like, "I'll put that in a sermon soon, buddy." He's in children's ministry. He doesn't know. And so, but I think that's the way we think sometimes. We think we want the benefits of Jesus without the cost. We want all the things that benefit us from Jesus. We want to be saved, but we want it on our own terms. Sometimes we have, in the Deep South particularly, treated a relationship with Jesus like a negotiation process. Jesus sits down and goes, "I gave up everything on your account," and we go, "Okay, Jesus, here's the things I'll do, and here are the things I won't do." We want Jesus on our own terms. We want Jesus the way we want him. We want Jesus to invite us to things. We want to build our life, and then we want to call on Jesus and ask him to say a blessing over it. But what Jesus is saying is not, "Do what you can for me and I'll stand." But what Jesus is saying, Jesus is not talking about salvation here. Jesus is turning to the crowds and he's saying, "But will you give up everything to follow after me?" Jesus is saying to the crowds, it's easy to be a part of the crowd, but will you be committed? Jesus said it's easy to be a part of the big gathering, but will you follow no matter where it leads you? That's what Jesus is walking this group through here. Jesus is asking us if we want real life or we want to keep riding on the merry-go-round of everybody else's approval. There's a verse later in the New Testament in Hebrews 12:1 that says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great crowd of witnesses, huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off everything that weighs and slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, that we might run with endurance the race that God has set before us." Jesus is here saying, "Hey, do you want to trade in your counterfeit life for the one I actually want to give you? Do you want to trade in the selfie life where we spend more time making sure everything looks right in our facade? You want to trade in that counterfeit?" And Jesus says, "I'll give you the real thing." But too many of us would settle for a counterfeit that everybody else buys than the real thing that might cost us something. That's the challenge of what Jesus says. Then, when you start walking through this passage, you almost wish Jesus just meant hate. And you could wrestle with it emotionally rather than having to get to the core of what Jesus is actually calling us to. So there are these two images Jesus uses. And look, there's a lot to these images we could talk more about, but we can't walk through all the details. This is what some things Jesus says. Jesus tells a story about a man who's building a tower. And then he tells a story about a king. So you get this, the man who's building a tower is most likely in that context either a farmer who's building a tower for storage and security of his property, or a husband and a father who's building it to protect his family's land. And so you have this common man, and then you get this other story about a king and royalty. You get the first story is about something positive happening. So many good things are happening, the guy needs to build more stuff. In the second story, it's a king who's underprepared for what's ahead of him. He's only got 10,000 soldiers going out to face an army of 20,000. The point of these two being paired together, without going into a lot of the context, is Jesus is a creative storyteller. So what Jesus does, he goes, look, whether you're a common man or you're a royal, whatever economic and social strata you're a part of, if things are going well in your life and you're expanding, or things look like you're headed for a valley that you can't handle, wherever you are and whatever you are, Jesus steps onto the scene to be the Lord of your life, to be the center by which we see everything else in our life revolve. That's the point of the story. It doesn't matter if good or bad, socially high, socially low, you got too much or you got too little. Jesus comes and invites all of us to let him be the center of our story. That's why in verse 33, he ends this section by saying, so you cannot be my disciple without giving up everything you own. It is easier to be a part of the crowd than a follower. It's easier to be curious than committed. It is easier to be on the fringe and be anonymous than it is to be fully devoted to Jesus. I want my life the way I want it. I want control of my life. I want to live safe. But sometimes I have to recognize that I don't need safety as much as I need Jesus. Life on my terms has continued to get me what it gets me. I don't need my life to be safe. I need to lose it for the sake of the gospel in Jesus Christ. That's the call of this passage. Which leads us to a question we have to wrestle with. And be honest, it's one of those questions you don't ask in church a lot. And if you're thinking it, you'll probably look down and jot something down like we're being studious. But here's the question I kept coming back to in this passage this week. Is it even worth it? I mean, is it worth it to follow? I mean, if Jesus is negotiating with us on such intensive terms, if Jesus is coming on board and saying, hey, I want everything in your life. You're not a football player to be a football player. You're a football player to be a missionary to me on that team. Hey, I put you in that classroom. This is an incredible conversation, students, as so many of you head back to school. God doesn't place you in those classrooms simply to academically excel, but when we follow after Jesus, it costs us everything. We're there to be a missionary in our classrooms and our school. You want to avoid a lot of the brokenness that we as grown-ups have, that we as adults have in our lives? Make decisions based on what Jesus wants for you rather than just what you want for yourself. Is it worth it? What if Jesus asked me to downsize my house and live somewhere smaller and be radically generous? What if Jesus asked me to move across town or walk across the street or move across the globe? I mean, is it really worth it to follow after Jesus if it would cost me everything? All the work and savings and reputation that I've accrued, is it worth it if Jesus asked me to give every bit of it away? Is it even worth it to follow him? And while that question lingers in the air, let's talk about what Jesus is doing in this passage. You see, as Jesus gives space for everybody to ask this question, for all of us to have the freedom for our lukewarm experiences of faith, for all the times that we dabble in following Jesus and then we pull back out when it gets too complicated, for everybody in human history who's made that choice, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's on his way to Jerusalem to die. You see, while we're wrestling with whether or not Jesus is worth it, Jesus has already decided that we are. Jesus turns and faces a crowd and goes, will you go with me? Will you follow after me? Will you take a message of hope and grace and love to the world, even if it costs you your reputation? While Jesus is asking them to answer the question, is it even worth it? When he finishes, he turns and with his face locked in, he heads to Jerusalem to die for the very people who are considering it. Isn't that incredible? Jesus doesn't make the pronouncement of everybody who will give up everything can follow after me, and those who don't cannot, and then go, I'll go wait over on the side for y'all to turn in your applications. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus finishes and starts back walking to Jerusalem. Because while we're wrestling with whether or not Jesus is worth it, he's already proclaimed that we are. We were worth everything that Jesus paid. We were worth everything that Jesus endured. You see, your identity and my identity is not bound up in the reputation that we've spent so much blood, sweat, and tears to create. Our identity was sowed, sealed, and delivered on a hill on the outskirts of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. When Jesus declared for every ounce of our brokenness, every moment of our wish-washiness, every moment when we're hesitant or questioning if it's even worth it, Jesus paid it all when we weren't sure if we'd pay anything. There's this verse, we read Hebrews 12:1 a minute ago. The next verse says this: we run the race that's set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. The joy? Any of you ever seen a painting of the cross look like joy to you? Any of you ever watched The Passion or another movie that's created to try to give our minds some idea of how to imagine something that we can't really fully wrap our brains around? Does it look like joy to you? I mean, what is the writer of Hebrews thinking when he says Jesus endured the joy? Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Jesus gave up his reputation. He gave up his life because of the joy. You know what the joy of the cross is? Everybody's saved by it. Jesus looked at every person that would ever believe and realized that every part of their brokenness has been paid by what he shed. Jesus saw what would be gained, so he gave his life away. And when Jesus asked us to give up everything we have, to live selfless in a selfie world, Jesus is saying, would you look at what's already been paid for you? And in response to the gospel, offer your life, offer what you have, your time, your talents, your gifts, and your resources. Would you give those away that somebody else might hear about the same thing that saved even the likes of you and me? While we're wrestling with if Jesus is worth it. If you're here today simply because you're curious, you came because somebody invited you, you're checking in on live stream or Facebook Live, and you're not even sure how you got there. For every single one of us, while we wrestle with, is this true? Do we believe it? Would we offer our lives? Just know the truth of the gospel is that Jesus has already proclaimed you worth it. Your identity is sealed and delivered. You just have to receive the gift of it. John Stott, who we talked about earlier, Stott comes to faith in college, which I told you about, and then goes and has that conversation with his dad. And when he came to faith, the pastor preaching, when he felt a call to ministry, rather, the pastor was preaching from this one verse in Revelation 3. Look, I stand at the door and knock. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in and we will share together a meal as friends. That's the one verse the pastor read and then talked about these words of Jesus. And Stott, years later, says this is the most dynamic, life-changing, altering moment in his whole journey. And I'm going to show you a long quote. Now, I don't often show long quotes, but I want you to see some of the language. I want to walk you through it. This is what John Stott writes. Have we ever opened our door to Christ? Have we ever invited him in? This was exactly the question which I needed to have put to me. I had believed in Jesus all my life on the other side of the door. I had believed in Jesus all my life on the other side of the door. I had regularly struggled to say my prayers through the keyhole. I'd even pushed pennies under the door in a vain attempt to pacify him. I went to church, read my Bible, had high ideals, and tried to be good and do good, but all the time, often without realizing it, I was holding Jesus Christ at arm's length and keeping him outside. I knew that to open the door might have momentous consequences. I'm profoundly grateful for him for enabling me to open the door. Looking back now, more than 50 years, I realize that it was this simple step has changed the entire direction, course, and quality of my life. Friends, in a room this size, how many of us here in Tupelo at Northside on Facebook or on live stream, how many of us have believed in Jesus from the other side of the door? We believe Jesus in our own terms. We've lived a good life, and we've been nice to people. And when we've talked bad about them, we only whispered it to people we could trust. We've done as good as we possibly could. But we've kept Jesus at arm's length because to let him fully into our lives might cost us. Friends, to claim us as his own cost Jesus everything. And we keep trying to pay rent on the life that Jesus has already purchased. Friends, what would happen today if you took your hand and you opened the door and let Jesus fully in? What compartment, what aspect of your life have you held back from him? What avenue of your existence have you said, I just don't know if it's worth it. I don't know if the cost that it would mean to me would be worth it. Well, know this, Jesus has already declared us worth it. Our feeble steps, our broken lives, our in-betweens, our ups and downs, our mountains and valleys, Jesus has claimed all of it as his territory. And we keep some separation and distance between us. Would we count the cost? Would we deem him worthy? Would we put on our hand on the knob, open the door, and see what God might want to do with us? Let's pray together. God, I thank you. I thank you for the ways that you push and challenge. I thank you for the complication of the invitation to, in comparison to how much we love and offer you, to hate everything else in our life. And I pray we would be able to experience messiah, that Greek word which means to place deference, to decrease in importance. That our schools, our families, our homes, everything would decrease in importance, not because we don't love and cherish those moments and opportunities, but because they would be secondary to our allegiance to you and the call that you have placed on us. God, what I pray right now for my life and all those within the sound of my voice is that you would give us the strength to reach out and open the door. If we not have the strength, I pray you'd bust it down for us. Because the life we actually want, the life we were actually created for, will never be lived absent of you. To you, our Father, in the name of Jesus, and by the power of your Holy Spirit, we pray.